Okay, welcome everyone here and those online to this seminar of the Bologna Institute for Policy Research seminar series. We are very honored and delighted to have here today my very good friend, an ancient friend and colleague from Moscow Carnegie Center.
I'm not that old. I'm not ancient.
We have ancient friendship going years back. Alexander Gabuev, who is a senior fellow at Moscow Carnegie Center and who chairs also the program at Moscow Carnegie for Russia in Asia Pacific. He needs no further introduction. He's extremely well known as perhaps the key to go-to person for any expertise on Russia-China relations. He is extremely well informed and astute observer of this relationship. A lot of people talk about Russia-China relations. In Washington, everywhere around the world, this is a relationship that interests a lot of people. Unfortunately, very few people actually know what they're talking about. Alex, in this regard, is a major exception. Even people like me, I would see myself as an observer of Sino-Russian relations. I know a lot about them. I know a lot about this relation, but in many ways, I'm an ersatz observer. Yeah, I'm an ersatz. The real thing is sitting here. Sasha is people who, okay, so 99.9% of the time, if people hear me talk about Sino-Russian relations, they are convinced because they don't know much themselves, and I can convince them. I come across as very convincing. The 0.1% who are not convinced know that the real thing is Sasha. So he will be, I'm very delighted here to have you here today. We're not having a formal presentation of any kind. We're just having a free flow in conversation. So I will start off our conversation with just a few questions. We'll go back and forth a little bit for maybe a few minutes, but then I want to open up the floor to you guys. We'll have a broader discussion. Make sure you've got your microphone in hand. Introduce yourself when you ask your question so that people online can hear. And then we'll also turn to folks online. Those joining us online, please put your questions into Q&A. I don't even see the Q&A thing here, but I'm sure it will come up. It will, yeah, I'm being reliably promised that it'll come up there. So with this, welcome.
With this, on my first day at Carnegie, one of my bosses told me, Sasha, be relaxed. American modern culture is all about self-promotion, so you shouldn't be shy. I'm having thick skin for the amount of kind of compliments you need to deliver to yourself and to your colleagues, but that was grossed by my centers.
You more than deserve. You more than deserve.
Okay. Let's go to the real stuff.
Right. So the real stuff. Okay, China and Russia, two countries that just befuddle a lot of people, including myself. You look at this relation, you wonder what's up. So let's just jump. I'll just start you off with a very easy and at the same time very, very difficult question, especially that the subject of our conversation is, of course, China, Russia, and Ukraine in the context of the crisis over Ukraine. So let me ask you this. What did China know? How much did they know?
I think they are sincere when they say that they didn't know much. My impression reading the Chinese official analysis that's open source, the way the Chinese Russia watchers commented in newspapers, and recalling some of my conversations right before the war started. I was talking to several Chinese colleagues who are in various forms connected to the government and to the intelligence part of the government. And even in lengthy conversations, some of these people would say, but this is nuts. Like, going to war with Ukraine is nuts. That's not going to happen. And I think that they made the same mistake that many of the well-informed Russian analysts made. Like, the downsides are so obvious. That's what they got clear. They didn't probably get the emotional level, like how can a Russian leader in his late 60s, born in St. Petersburg and blockade with all of this cult of great patriotic war, go to war with Ukraine. So it's unattainable for a Russian. But for Chinese, the pragmatical downsides were so clear that they said that's definitely not going to happen. And we know through New York Times that once the team, Joe Biden, tried to present them with some evidence and share some intelligence, of course, the US was holding its card very close to its chest. And it's clear why. The intelligence was so accurate that the sources and methods must be really, really sensitive. That's why they didn't share it even with closest allies. And the head of the French defense agency had to resign because he was not aware of what's going on. But the intelligence was very accurate. So Chinese turned it to the Russians and said that, oh, the Americans are trying to plant a wedge between us. So their analysis and their knowledge showed that nothing is happening. And then the crucial meeting was on February 4, when Vladimir Putin traveled to Beijing for the opening of the Olympics. And I don't expect that they had a conversation. I don't expect that this was discussed, because you remember that scene on February 21, when Russia has an extended meeting of the Security Council, and like the most senior Russian decision makers were discussing whether to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. And some of them were visually shocked. Either this group should deserve a collective Oscar for perfect stage performance, or these people really didn't anticipate that it's going into this direction, that what Vladimir Putin wants them is to take collective responsibility for going into what's prelude to war.
Well, that's what gets me. When people say, you know, the Chinese knew, you look at this meeting, you look at those faces, you think, if he did not tell his closest
head of the external intelligence, the SVR, like this guy was probably not, in a way, like, why would he tell this Xi Jinping with his interpreters present, with other people's in the room present?
Yeah.
And everything we know about this relationship tells us that it's not an alliance.
Yeah.
And it's not that the most delicate decisions have been discussed. Crimea annexation was a surprise. War in Donbass was a surprise.
I'm thinking Kazakhstan was a surprise.
Kazakhstan was a surprise.
Do you think the Chinese knew that the Russians were sending forces to Kazakhstan until it actually happened?
Probably there could have been a call. I don't know whether they were briefed about the preparation of the operation.
It doesn't seem like they were particularly joyful over this, by the way, when this happened. They're like, we also blame color revolutions and whatnot, but it seems like they did not really anticipate that Russia would act so swiftly in Kazakhstan. And then that's why they talked about Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all that stuff.
But that's a different story.
It's a different story, but it's just an interesting
Russians were protecting their interests as well. So
Yeah.
they were not unhappy at the end. They didn't have the capabilities to deliver this operation in Kazakhstan that Russia had.
Yeah.
But on Ukraine, I'm actually believing them when the Chinese officials, like the ambassador to the US, Qin Gang, says like China didn't know anything. I think that it's very believable and convincing.
But here's an interesting, and I'll throw this historical anecdote at you. In 1958, and you know, of course, I love those historical parallels. This is my thing. In 1958, there was this conflict between the Russians and the Chinese over this joint submarine fleet, as you know. And Mao really lashed out at the Soviet ambassador Yudin, and he sent a cable to Khrushchev saying, "Okay, Chairman Mao is off the rails." And Khrushchev immediately flew to Beijing, and they had several days, 4 days of consultations, where in that famous swimming pool consultations, where they were when Mao was swimming in the swimming pool in Zhongnanhai and got Khrushchev. So we've got all of those meetings now, and you know what's surprising? Of course, we know what happened after Khrushchev left, which was China started bombarding Jinmen Islands, and nothing was discussed in those 4 days of but here's a really bizarre thing. Right before Khrushchev left, and I'm sorry, I'm unleashing a historian here, but right before he left, Mao just threw this one thing at him, said, "Well, can we publish a communique of your visit?" And Khrushchev was like, "Well, that's supposed to be a secret visit. Why should we do that?" And he insisted. And so later, it became transparent that what Mao was trying to do is, without informing Khrushchev that he was planning to attack Jimin. He actually wanted the world to believe that there was a consultation. So do you think that Putin, by going to Beijing on February 4th, do you think he tried to project a sense that China was behind his decision making? I mean, did he decide by then, do you think? Or is it something that he decided later? Because we've got several weeks before February 4th and February 24th in 20 days.
It's clear to know, if you're not the US government, whether he has decided or not. And by that time, Biden said that he was like nearly sure that Putin has decided, but the diplomats can still talk till the first shots are fired.
Well, he publicly said that. He's like, yeah, Putin
Right.
decided,
So
but we can
probably he has decided back then. And then the whole massing up of troops, this diplomatic decoy with publishing of the exchanges between Lavrov and his German and French counterparts, this demand for security guarantees and role play, like let's pretend that it was the US which lost the Cold War. So you need to go back to the 1997 lines in Europe and withdraw your nukes. So all of these crazy ideas were already there. Like, why would you do that if you have not decided? And that's kind of all of the pieces of the puzzle are coming together. Yeah. So most likely he knew by then. But this visit was in the works, as far as I know, since middle of 2021. Okay. Like Putin really wanted to go to China to talk about Power of Siberia 2, like the gas pipeline, bringing gas from Yamal Peninsula that serves European customers to China. That's been in the works and discussion for a couple of years now.
Is it the Trans-Mongolian or is it the Trans-Mongolian?
That's the Trans-Mongolian.
Trans-Mongolian, yeah.
And about some other economic issues. And that there was this need to show that this relationship is functioning amid collapsing or problematic relationship with the West. So it's been in the works for some time. And then they locked in this date for the opening of the Olympics. And that was kind of returning Xi Jinping favor to coming to the opening of Sochi Olympics back then. So I don't think that this optics is relevant, but it's interesting that many people in the West were so shocked by the joint statement. I think that you and I have read many of those statements.
Well, I mean, it was interesting. I mean, the joint statement was unusual. You have to agree. I mean, it was not unusual in the sense that, I mean, we had the joint op-ed in the national interest by the Russian and Chinese ambassadors. That was in December.
Right.
And that kind of aired some of the same ideas. But I don't think this kind of language about this kind of ideological affinity was really...
The ideological affinity is somewhat expanded and new, but that's also was there in the 2021 joint statement for the anniversary of signing the border treaty.
Okay.
What was really new is that the US for the first time joined Russia's criticism of NATO expansion.
You mean China joined?
China joined, and that was something new, but that was sort of traded. Well, China has a lot of list of grievances towards NATO, particularly since NATO members started to send their ships to Taiwan Strait and South China Sea.
This is cheap. I don't see, I mean, people see that as a big deal, but I think this is cheap for China to support Russia's narrative of NATO enlargement because they don't have to pay for it.
Exactly.
It's like, yeah, we can support it.
But it's interesting that like many people took it so seriously. So other people haven't been watching this relationship and what happened, particularly since 2014, but before that. And to me, it's like the pendulum in the Western policymaking community that before, I remember just on my first weeks in Carnegie job in 2015, I came to DC and talked to several people in the then Obama government. And people were like, yeah, Sasha, are you trying to convince us that it's something serious that the US should be concerned about? It's not. There's not much there. Like, really, like if Russia wants to be enslaved by China, go ahead. But then there's nothing of concern to us. And I think that was pretty similar attitude in Europe as well. So there is this level of ignorance or the ignorance that people wanted to portray. And then it goes to the other opposite side where people say like, oh, it's an authoritarian axis. It's like Xi Jinping and Putin.
Like Mao and Stalin.
Exactly. That's the major.
You have these people in DC who just do that. I mean, not to criticize pertaining to anyone in particular, but I have seen that. You know, this is interesting, and that just shows, and that again, you know, shows that the lack of the depth of expertise. If people
Inside the
don't want
government, there are many people who I think, even on the most senior levels, like my former colleagues like Bill Burns and other, had very nuanced, in my view, understanding of this relationship. And
Yeah.
now they're sitting on US classified documents, so
Yeah,
they know
of
much
course.
more than I do.
Of course.
But obviously, there are people who have really good lens to analyze this, and there are some good people in the think tank community as well.
Yeah.
But the overall mood was just so different, and it's interesting that from this ignorance and saying that there is no there, people just jump to
To
the
the
extreme.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you find well, I've got quite a few questions, but let me, before I open up, find a little question that I think you would have something to share with us is concerns this U.S. intelligence that Russia allegedly requested lethal aid from China, and that China allegedly has agreed to provide lethal aid in Ukraine. What do you make of it?
First, you should stand corrected. China, like the reports didn't say that China has agreed. The report said that there was a request coming after February 24 for some weapon types, and like there were various types of weapons, including drones and missiles that have been mentioned. To me, the plausible explanation for this is following. From a military standpoint, it wouldn't make much sense to ask for systems as this war is ongoing, because it was in the first week after the war, according to Bloomberg.
And they can't expect it for months, right?
Right, they can't expect it for months. If it's drones, like it takes months to deliver, even if they're taken from the PLA stash. If it's these are not new drones produced by for Russia, but then they are taken from the PLA stash and brought to the front line.
And do the Russians have to be trained with it?
Exactly. You need to train the operators, or you need to involve Chinese operators and develop interoperability between Chinese Putonghua speaking operators and the Russians,
which there's like zero.
Doesn't make sense at all. So my theory of the case is that we know that before the war, for the last 4 or 5 years, there is understanding growing in Moscow that yes, we are major donor of military technology to China, and we decided to supply some very sensitive and advanced systems, particularly after the 2014 annexation of Crimea. That was a gesture of kind of political trust towards China, and Russia made a U-turn in its policy adopted by kind of around 2005, 2006, when Russia decided not to sell advanced weaponry to China.
So by advanced weaponry, do you mean S-400?
S-400, Su-35. China was the first buyer, like not the cutting edge, not the last generation that Russia has, but before that. And as much as that happened, the Russian military leadership has realized that China is more advanced in some types of weapons that Russia doesn't have. Drones are the most important example. There are Russian military analysts like Vasily Kashin, who is the king of this kind of little fiefdom of Russia-China military analysis, that has publicly advocated for buying some systems. And we know that this reflects some thinking inside the Kremlin. So the interest to buy some systems from China was there. What I assume is that there is an ongoing negotiation between Russia and China. And maybe one of the letters from the Ministry of Defense or Rosoboronexport came to China after February 24. So this piece of intelligence is accurate, but it was taken out of context and presented to the media, where the person who leaked this information to the FT and Bloomberg and others was not lying. He said that Russia has sent a formal request for military hardware to China after February 24, when it started this brutal war in Ukraine. And then it was like the media that were writing on one source, and then, okay, it was hard to check this because China has denied those reports. But I think that this intelligence is credible and real, but it was framed a certain way because the timing is interesting. It was published right before the meeting between Yang Zichi the Politburo
in
member
Rome,
in Rome, and
yeah,
Jake Sullivan.
and Jake Sullivan. So what surprises me here is, obviously this kind of stuff is not leaked for no reason. Obviously, it's leaked for a reason, and the warning signal was sent to the Chinese. Surely the Americans, at least at that level, I mean, they're not FT reporters, right? The people who actually handle this intelligence. Why would they try to put pressure on China in this kind of way?
It's, I think that right now, if you try to frame U.S. foreign policy at the moment, what it's all about, it's about changing Russia calculus and making Putin pay the price, and then ultimately stop this war through coercion. For this, you need sanctions to be efficient, and you need to close all the loopholes. And then as long as China continues to buy Russian oil and gas and has trade in electronic goods and other elements of this, well, China does this at the same time as Europe continues to buy still Russian oil and gas. But still, you need to put pressure in order to deny Russia opportunities to do business with China, or expand business with China, or circumvent sanctions.
But
and that's why
Putin way, though, this is kind of strange.
Does it surprise you?
No?
Oh, the U.S. has been known as a very gentle power that whenever it wants something,
so here's
it's
a conspiracy. Here, how you what do you make of this conspiracy theory that that whoever sent this letter from Russia for whatever purchase of whatever drones or something else in the Ministry of Defense well realized that could trigger something in terms of that could be picked up by intelligence or something, and precisely wanted to signal that there's cooperation.
But that's too complicated, and I think that's too complicated.
I agree with you.
Use your Occam razor,
yes,
all the time, and then like the result would be counterproductive for Russian interests, because what we know is that the Chinese side is very cautious. They know that there are too many moving pieces, that for the US, it's really a very important issue for the time being, that it won't trigger the change in the nature of US-China relationship.
But wouldn't they, so let's say if you're a policymaker, let's say you're Putin, and you're trying to push the Chinese to become more, to get off the fence on your side, and you're trying to sell this to them at that particular moment as a way to kind of bring the Chinese over now.
You don't have that much leverage, and then your moves might be counterproductive because Chinese might be offended, and they actually might react in a different way. They might say, oh, they might publicly say, we have no intention to send whatsoever military equipment to Russia anytime as this war goes on. So I think that was probably the US goal, to drag this words out of Yang Zhiqi's mouth. Yang Zhiqi is a very experienced diplomat, so he was sticking to the talking points that China is a peace-loving country that supports peace and that supports territorial integrity of Ukraine, and is gravely concerned about the humanitarian situation out there. But he was not referring to anything that the US side wanted him to refer.
Right. Okay. Well, look, we've had a pretty good start, folks. Please, feel free to ask questions so that we have a broader discussion instead of just two Sino-Russian hands talking to one another. We've been discussing this issue for ages. So, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Hi, I'm Martin. I'm a student here from Germany. My question is picking up Professor Redchenko's sort of parallel to the Second Taiwan Strait crisis. Khrushchev's response in this case was very, two-faced, publicly making these maximalist statements that he was going to go with China all the way, but privately trying to console the US side. Are we likely to see something like that from China emerge in the future? Some back channel cooling of relations, or even some cooperation with the sanctions?
I think the problem is this. China knows very well that the nature of US-China relationship won't change, even if China is supportive to Western sanctions. The US is likely to pocket that, say, thank you so much, China. You've been a good part of the rules-based order. But what about Taiwan? What about South China Sea? What about Xinjiang? What about this and that? So the US-China rivalry, which is the overarching principle, is not going away. It's a temporary distraction. So we don't know what's being discussed during the Rome meeting and then phone call between Biden and Xi Jinping. But if I were China, I would ask, okay, imagine we support some of the sanctions. Does it mean that sanctions against Huawei are going away? Does it mean that sanctions against the party secretary of Xinjiang and other officials are going away? And the US says, no, of course not. These are terrible crimes that you've committed and you need to be punished for this. But here you need to be a responsible global citizen and punish this terrible villain Vladimir Putin. So the instrument in your toolbox is sticks, right? So more sticks are coming your way, China, if you are enabling Putin's war machine. The China's calculus is that, okay, sticks are coming our way regardless, not because we are helping Putin, but because we are China. And there is a bipartisan consensus in the US that China is bad, and they will unleash the sanctions kraken or whatever at us, and that's the long-term goal. So we don't want to be provocative in order to speed this process up. We don't want to violate sanctions against Russia in order not to be met with secondary sanctions. And right now, the situation is so much in flux that being of help to Russia deliberately, like coming out to them and say, like, this is the way we can circumvent the sanctions, is just too dangerous because like the sanctions are being piled up. The US has just announced a new package. So I think that China takes borrows page from its reaction to 2014 annexation of Crimea. It was observing the letter of the sanctions all the time. And then it was looking at what it can do for the state-owned banks that are not the commercial banks, but the policy banks like China Development Bank, Exim Bank, the Silk Road Fund, and then walk around legal channels that would provide limited help to Russia, definitely to benefit of China, right? To lock in some lucrative deals in oil and gas. And I think that here China will be willing to talk to the US and to say like, oh, we're trying to be helpful. Like we are talking to Putin and we tell him that peace should be observed and pursued and that war is a bad idea. But they don't want to kind of come to Putin because they know themselves that when foreigners come to China and say, this Mr. Xi is in the best interest of the Chinese people, they hated guts, right? Same with Putin. When foreigners tell him what's in interest of Mother Russia, he hates his guts. So why would Xi Jinping do this to Vladimir Putin, right? So they talk and they imitate or being helpful, but they know that their leverage on Russia is very limited. And they want to show to the US that, hey, we are trying to be helpful, but don't push us too hard because we don't have tools. And like this guy has this proceed for kind of breaking up Ukraine's sovereignty. So, but we are innocent and we have nothing to do with enabling his war machine. We are just maintaining our legitimate trade interests.
So I'm aware that we've got a lot of questions on here, and I want to kind of alternate. So actually, I think that would be also fair. So hold on, guys in the audience. Let me turn to one of the questions online, and we have actually a question here from a very astute, insightful observer of Sino-Russian relations forever. Professor Gil Rosman, he's got a question. Sasha, what was the goal of your writings over many years to show strains in Sino-Russian relations despite overall improvement? Did you think someone in the Kremlin was interested in changing course? Was this parallel to the late Brezhnev effort to get the Kremlin to change course by authors on China?
No, I'm in analysis business, and I try to depict the picture of China-Russia relationship as I see it, based on the sources I have, which are public sources and some contacts with Chinese counterparts and Russian counterparts, and then describe an analytical picture for everybody. It's open to critics. Like you can say that you're wrong here, Sasha, and argue with me using facts. That's totally okay. That's what we all do in analysis business. In terms of advocacy for some policies inside Russia, I think that my experience working as a reporter for the diplomatic press corps with Lavrov or with President press corps with Medvedev and a little bit with Putin, has been that this expertise, the outside voices are not really fused into the system. So they are not needed for the system. The system has its own course. Like even in the US, the feedback loop is much better, right? And okay, it's an open democratic system. There are former officials going through the revolving door. But in Russia, like most of the outside experts on foreign policy are there to justify the ideas of the government or present them in a nice packageable way, but they are not really to deliberate and to change the course of the foreign policy. And that also concerns the foreign ministry itself. Like Sergei Lavrov is not a policymaker, he's an implementator.
Of Putin's great insight.
Right. So I think that as a Russian patriot, my duty was to provide a sound analysis that's factual, that can be deconstructed, but that's at least how much I can see things. And then argue for some pragmatic approaches, and whoever would kind of listen would listen, but then I would harbor zero illusions that it would be acted upon.
Let me, just very quickly building on this question, actually drawing on what Gil has said about the parallel with the early 80s. In the early 80s, of course, you had people in the Central Committee like Rachmanin, for example, who were so deeply anti-Chinese. They're like, I just could not, China it will never change. They are hostile to us. We should never even think about improving relations. But also at the same time, you had actors in the KGB, in the, around Brezhnev, some people like even Chernyaev and some others who were actually saying, no, let's try to see if we can change this relationship, which is, by the way, why the road towards Sino-Russian, Sino-Soviet normalization began in the early 1980s, and not, as a lot of people assume, under Gorbachev. It already started in approximately 82, 83. And so that, makes me wonder whether there is a China debate in the Russian foreign policy community, or, as you say, there's only one voice that matters. Are there different views? Are there some that are ideologically committed and say, no, China is our ideological ally, we should just embrace them, and because they're fellow authoritarians, and others are saying, well, we shouldn't come too close to them for X number of reasons?
There is a debate, or there used to be a debate, but I think that the smartest operators inside the system know that you need to figure out what the boss really thinks and wants. And then when the boss asks your opinion, you need to be either doing his line and telling him what he wants to hear, or if he's genuinely curious about the state of affairs, you need to give an honest answer. And then depending which part of the government we are talking about, there was a debate and there was a certain learning curve. So long before the war, part of Carnegie's mission is to educate great powers about each other and make them understand why certain country functions certain way, the way we see it at least. And through this mutual understanding, we try to diminish risk of war. Well, we have not been very successful in that case, but part of my job was bringing global best sinologists, being part of Carnegie and outside Carnegie, but extended Carnegie family to Moscow. And people at the central bank, people in very senior government positions would be very happy to receive them, to sit down with them, to talk about mounting debt crisis on kind of regional level. And then some people would be like really very well informed about China. So there was this desire to consume information, to share information about Russia-China relationship, at least the economic part of it. And you saw that there was a demand and debate on various pragmatic aspects, like, okay, can China really help us in import substitution? What about trade in RMB and ruble? Like, are they open to this? Why it's not going so easy as the Chinese tell us officially? Like, what's the sub story? So I think that there was a lot of interest in this, and there was a lot of internal debate, but on marginal issues, because in the last 3 or 4 years, my major argument domestically, as well as many people, was that, okay, if the US-China relationship is the major trend line in global geopolitics for the 21st century. Does Russia has an ability to maintain equidistance? Yes. What's going on in Russia-China relationship is the deepening of the symmetry, where China gets increasingly more powerful in this relationship and has more leverage. So that means that we need to try to maintain equidistance. And the way to do this is to become more pragmatic in our relationship with the US. Right? Why are we so ideologically obsessed with the US dominance and stuff? Like, why are all of these steps, interference in US elections, being taken that actually diminishes your space for maneuvering? So absent improvement of relationship with the West, no equidistance can achieve. Okay, if we agree that no, we're stuck with this ideological confrontation with the US, we put away one option. The other option is that why don't we unlock the potential for Russia to innovate? Why don't we really modernize and diversify the economy and just not remain this terrible and ugly hydrocarbon, like big oil and gas tank with other commodities? And like, let's do real genuine structural reforms. But they're not happening for the reasons of political control. So it's much easier to maintain the current system of governance and having the political control and redistribute the natural resources rent rather than enable due process in courts for entrepreneurs, which will undermine government's ability to control the system. So this option is also removed. And then you are stuck with very basic, narrow parameters of China-Russia relationship, where you don't modernize your economy and you don't become pragmatic in your foreign policy and don't try to improve relationship with the West. And in this very narrow corridor, there might be some discussion, right? But it's not this big, real national security debate that needs to happen in order to be successful in this relationship.
Okay, so, right. Questions from the audience here on this side? Yeah. Carolyn.
Hi, my name is Caroline Claff. Nice to meet you. I'm also a Carnegie intern this year, so very cool to meet you in person. My question is, if the war escalates and NATO involvement picks up, spills over into certain regions, I'm wondering how China might react, and if you could speak kind of big picture, and also maybe if the war escalates in certain aspects, if China might not do something or do something. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that China now has a framework that's very hard to move away from, because this framework serves their interest well. They have these talking points: peace, respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity, respect for Ukraine's sovereignty, no recognition of Crimea as part of Russia or Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states, and then criticizing unilateral sanctions as not being helpful in this crisis and detrimental to the health of global economy, and some mild criticism towards NATO expansion and US-led military alliances around the world. For domestic consumption, there is an all-out support for Russian war, but it's more because Maria Repnikova has, like the person we know who is the kind of the best expert on media politics in China. So Marie has written recently a piece in Atlantic where I think her main conclusion and her co-author is that this war is seen as a proxy conflict between the US and the US puppet, Ukraine, and somebody else. And that's why the Chinese public and the parties support this somebody else, because it's ultimately viewed as a battle for multipolarity or diminishing US hegemony. So this is the set of policies. And then on pragmatic level, they don't violate any sanctions. And they will be very patient and cautious in doing some new deals with the Russians, because they want this war, this hot stage of war to be over and all of the sanctions being imposed before they can figure out what the commercial opportunities they have. So with war continuing, they will just double down on the first part of the talking points. We want peace, we respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Probably there will be some more humanitarian aid. Probably there will be pledges for like, oh, we want to commit some money from Belt and Road Fund or AIB. to reconstruction of Ukraine. But expect no more than that. I don't expect them to really come into Putin and say, Vladimir, enough is enough. Either you stop this war or we join the sanctions and we cut off oil supplies. That's definitely not what they're going to do. So as tragic as it is, I think that even if there is risk of using chemical or biological weapons that the US government is so concerned about at the moment, China won't do much to really try to prevent this.
So we've got a question online from Connor O'Brien. Is it surprising that a country like China, which is in the middle of genocide, presumably that refers to the situation in Xinjiang, isn't condemning a country, Russia, that is currently carrying out what could be argued as opening stages of genocide? In other words, it seems to be that the argument is because the Chinese, we shouldn't be surprised the Chinese are not doing much about, let's say, Bucha, because they have their own thing in Xinjiang that is similar, etc.
But non-interference in affairs of the other is the overarching principle. That they're not very vocal about what's going on in Yemen. They were not very vocal about what's going on in Syria. They were not very vocal about what's going on in Libya. They are not very vocal about what's going on in Ukraine in terms of genocide or humanitarian situation. They say that they want peace, that it's the only mean to resolve conflicts. And that's basically this kind of non-aligned movement talking points that are very frequently put to use. And then the new trend line with world war diplomacy is criticism towards the US. And like when the US does something outrageous, or they kind of cherry pick all of the historical parallels with bombing of Yugoslavia or Iraq war or Afghanistan to kind of stick it back to the Americans, but not really taking an active position there. So I don't think that it's really surprising.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't connect it necessarily to the situation in Xinjiang.
I'm trying to think if historically the Chinese have ever criticized any kind of major genocide. I mean, they were on the side of the Khmer Rouge genocide. They were very, very good relationship with Pol Pot, for example. Sorry.
Did they say anything about Rohingya in Myanmar?
Well, I don't think so.
No, I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. Yeah. Okay. The questions from the audience here on this side. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mark Ortiz. My question is, seeing how the international response has been towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how do you think that has impacted, I guess, China's plans or ambitions for reunification of Taiwan? Like, has that pushed back their plans, or seeing not just the international response, but also how poorly it's gone in Ukraine? So anything you'd like to share with that?
First, I don't think that there was a direct parallel here. And like we saw this narrative, some people pushing it that, the moment Putin moves in Ukraine, China will move on Taiwan because the US attention will be stretched and it will need to contain both. We didn't see any evidence of this. We see that China continues to beef up its military muscle and to make the gun that it wants to put on the table at some point and tell Taiwan, hey, you either negotiate about reunification with us in good faith and in our terms where we have a clear timeline, or you see this gun, it's here for a purpose. So it takes time for them to make sure that their military muscle is so credible and that their tools available to them are so credible that it basically prevents US direct military interference in this conflict. Just like the US doesn't intervene in conflict in Ukraine. Legally, it's different because Ukraine is a sovereign country. Taiwan is recognized by most as part of China. But this military toolkit needs to be really expansive. And the nuclear deterrent is one of the crucial elements here. So all of these reports about the massive buildup of Chinese conventional nuclear forms, the silos, like really making sure that you have a second strike capability in a case of nuclear war with the US is part of that. I'm not a nuclear scientist. My Carnegie colleagues are far better at this, but their estimate is that it takes China another 10 years to arrive there where they will have really credible nuclear deterrent on par with the US. And then the US will continue to evolve, so they will need to adapt as well. So that's part of it. But if there is any lesson, I think that China will look at this situation and say, hey, Russians believe in their own mantras of being successful in import substitution and in de-dollarization of the economy. It didn't occur to them that somebody can freeze their US dollar and euro holdings of the central bank. And it didn't occur to them to look deeper into the supply chain and figure out that you can localize production of a complicated industrial machine. And it can be 80% localized. But then the rest, the remaining 20% of parts are sourced from somewhere else. And in many cases, like there is a German family-run business that dates back to 19th century. And that produces a certain particle worth 50 euros. But without this particle, a $100 million machine is a piece of rubbish. It's not functional if you cannot source this particular detail. So they would say, oh, Russians did this mistake. They were stupid. We shouldn't do this. So I think that the response will be doubling down on programs like Made in China 2025, massive import substitution, indigenous innovation, and de-dollarization of their systems. So when the day comes and the West will threaten sanctions, they are far better sanction-proof than Russia.
But China, on the other hand, is much more integrated in the global economy, you would say. You would think that.
I agree. And then there is a terrific piece in Macro Polo by Rita Rudnick, which shows like, oh, everybody thought that the supply chain is diversifying away from China. It's much harder done than said. And it is that the consequences for the West and for the global economy will be much bigger because the West has never tried to sanction economy as big and as integrated in the global market as Russia. Mm-hmm. But the two major channels of why Russia is important to the health of global economy are fuels and agricultural stuff. And that also involves Ukraine as a big agricultural producer. So there are two channels of fuel inflation and food inflation that really matter most. Okay, metals as well. But on everything else, Russia is not that important. And China is a very different story. So here, trying to punish China will have definitely huge side effects for the West as well. So I think that probably the West will also take some lessons. And probably some companies will remember that experience of running away from Russia very fast. And that if that's the case, if like we are entering the stage where great power competition takes really ugly forms like proxy wars, probably they need to think about diversifying their supply chain, even if that's costly.
Both sides, you mean?
Both sides. Probably the West will need to adapt to and reduce its exposure to China, which again is much easier said than done.
Mm-hmm. So here's a follow-up question, Mark's question about Taiwan. Do you think the Chinese are generally more risk averse compared to the Russians? I mean, if you look at the Russian pattern of foreign policy behavior, they just keep invading countries. But the Chinese don't do this. The Chinese have not historically invaded all that many countries. In fact, the last time they invaded anybody, I think, was Vietnam in 1979, which was a long time ago. And before that, India in '62, and of course, the Korean War. So which almost actually this reminds me of this very interesting episode during the Cold War where Khrushchev and Mao were talking about Hong Kong, and Khrushchev was like, why don't you just take over Hong Kong, because you can easily do that. And Mao said, you know, you don't understand how this works. And of course, throughout until obviously the handover, Hong Kong remained part of Britain. So do you think that indicates that the Chinese are risk averse compared to the Russians?
I think that their risk appetite is much lower. They're much more pragmatic, and then the legitimacy of the party is based on economic performance as well. I think that my limited knowledge of Chinese tells me that Russians are much more patient they are much readier to sacrifice for greater cause that the government propaganda tells them are needed than the Chinese. If things go south in the economy, Chinese get very angry very quickly, and they go out to the streets. And like my favorite metaphor is, if you look at the last 300 years of Russia's history, the power has always changed in the capital and in the capital only, be it Moscow or St. Petersburg. In China, throughout what, 2000 plus years, various big events in various parts of the country have toppled.
Started as rebellions. Yes,
for economic causes,
yeah.
most of the times.
Yeah.
So this is a densely populated country that if you cannot contain a rebellion in some part for a month or so, then your dynasty might be doomed. And I think that Chinese, it's a very ruthless, brutal regime in terms of use of force. They're not shy from using force. But at the same time, the well-being of people and the economic performance is the other pillar. So doing something that Putin just did, ruining the economy, pursuing the case of geopolitical greatness or whatever drives him to invade Ukraine, is not something that China will do. And there will be pragmatic analysis of the downsides of this. And I think that this is something that still prevents them from doing really ruthless.
But is it just because Xi Jinping is smarter than Putin? No, because it seems institutionally there are no real constraints, and they're in a similar position. If Xi Jinping wanted to invade, I don't know, who you want, Taiwan, could he do that?
So it's somewhat different, and I think that we don't really have a very clear picture of how Politburo Standing Committee works with Xi Jinping. I think that we have a lot of facts pointing to the direction that is much more leader-centric than it used to be under Hu Jintao or any other predecessor. But whether there are some informal checks and balances, I think there probably are. And some of the, it looks like China is able to correct its course on some, for example, Russia-Ukraine war. Right before meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping and Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi, China was really violently on Russia's side in its domestic propaganda. And then right before the meeting, we saw some twist in tone. So the coverage became somewhat more balanced, both in English language media, like the Global Times and CGTN, but also domestically in Xinhua. Why? I think that China figured out that its propaganda travels across China's border in 21st century.
Surprising. People actually read this stuff.
People actually read this stuff.
Oh my God, look at what this guy Hu Jintao has written.
Exactly. So they figure out that they need this before the meeting to show that, oh, no, we're not on Russia's side. We have a more balanced, nuanced picture. See, here are kind of the poor refugees and this stuff. So they can self-correct on some issues. The way they handle Evergrande and the property crisis, like it shows that there are deliberations inside this black box of Chinese politics.
So this is how you would explain those strange things like the coverage of some massacres by the Russian forces in the Chinese state media. Is that you think that this is a deliberate attempt to kind of signal something to the American audiences?
Yeah, I think that they don't want to be portrayed as kind of 100% buying into this narrative. So I think that if there is a country that follows Barack Obama's mantra, don't do stupid shit, it's China for now. They do a lot of
Russia, of course, does exactly the opposite.
Right.
What is the stupid shit we can do? Let's do that. Do stupid shit. I'm getting emotional now. Always bad. Okay, let's see, folks here.
Just before we are getting the question, one example, like the relationship with the West is tested by this war. Yeah. What does China do? They send Wang Yi to India to patch things up with Jai Shankar and to kind of improve relationship with the neighbors, using this opportunity to kind of, as the US is stuck in Europe, that's the golden moment for them to buy time for internal development. For this, you need to last conflict with your neighbors. And I think that this is the reflection of the self-correction mechanism, whether that's strategic, whether they will come up with the idea that, hey, having this fight with India over some square kilometers in Himalaya that nobody really populates. So that's all ideological.
Yeah.
And we can turn on our propaganda to say that as a peace-loving country, we can settle this dispute and then put India back to sleep in a way and remove this perception of large threat. That would be smart, in my view. They don't do it yet.
Yeah.
But these tactical adjustments are still possible.
And you wonder how they must have some kind of institutional channels to do that. In other words, they solicit reports maybe from other parts of maybe the military or think tanks or something. I mean, we know how that worked back in the 1960s when Mao reoriented China towards the United States. This was preceded by a study. He actually instructed the four marshals, including of course Chen Yi, who was a former foreign minister, to study this question and submit recommendation. The recommendation was, yeah, we have two enemies and one of them is worse than the other. Therefore, let's patch up the relationship with the United States. And Mao, and this is Mao. I mean, this is a guy who is like absolute, the head of tyranny, and yet he's soliciting this kind of reports. And you wonder whether something like this exists in China today. I'm sure it does, and I wonder whether it exists in Russia. And I'm not so sure.
It does in China. Again, we need to admit that it's increasingly a black box where we have little ability to penetrate the details. But from circumstantial evidence we have, like we know that this process is still ongoing, and that Xi reads what kicker scholars write, and that sometimes the notes go to his desk. With Putin, we don't know, but I would assume that he doesn't read much of what think tanks write in Russia or seriously engages with those arguments.
He sort of just engages with himself, writing this wonderful article.
What I know that before the war, some time ago, a colleague of mine, Sasha Baunov, and that was a really different era. So he was in a studio of independent channel TV Rain, which is now banned in Russia. So he was there in TV Rain on one of the programs, and then he bumped into Dmitry Peskov, the mustached press secretary of President Putin. And he comes to meet him and say like, "Hi, I'm Sasha Baunov. I'm like heading this website run by Carnegie." And he said, "I know who you are, and I'm Dmitry Peskov, by the way. Not only do I know who you are, but I need to tell you that there are items on your website which I disagree with, but there are items that are very interesting. And I put some of your writings of Carnegie into the folder that goes to the big boss, because some information could be of interest to him." But that was 5 years ago, probably.
Yeah.
Different era.
Different.
That was before lockdown and self-isolation.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion. Peter Krakow from Budapest. I'm a visiting fellow here. I would have two short questions. First, can you imagine any scenario where China would give up its distance from the conflict and, for example, send weapons to Russia big time? So do you think that it's anyhow possible? And the second one would be something you have already touched upon, that how do you think this whole war will affect the stance of China, not only economically, because if I understand you well, the whole sanction regime will hurt less China than the Western world, but also politically. So as I see, it's rather giving a boost for China on the longer run strategically, but would be really curious on your take.
That were two questions. You promised three. Okay. Two. Oh, good. Okay. So on, I don't envisage this scenario where China will come in massive support for Russia, because that doesn't serve Chinese interests. China in this conflict is not pro-US, it's not pro-Ukraine, it's not pro-Russia, it's pro-China. And I think that this balanced foreign policy, where it thinks that relationship with Russia is too important to throw Russia under the bus, it knows that in this relationship, after Russia's economy has crashed and all of the possible sanctions are applied, and Russia is a giant North Korea to its border, well, China will have tremendous leverage and can exploit this relationship further, but it needs to think about safe ways to do that. And at the same time, relationship with the West are of paramount importance. China still depends a lot on access to Western markets, on access to Western technology. and it knows that things are going in a bad direction for China because of conflict with the West, and its sources are different than support for Putin, but it doesn't want to accelerate this process anyway. So I think that this balanced policy will continue. On politics, I think that where China sees an opportunity is that first, this war will bog down Biden administration for the remainder of Biden's term, most likely. It's not that this war is simply going away and then Biden people can say, well, we put all the possible sanctions, we've done everything possible, we're sending little aid to Ukraine, we go back to our kind of China pivot and stuff. It's not going to happen. Like this war will be dragging on and on and on, and will consume a lot of time where Jake Sullivan and Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin and Bill Burns and everybody else will be spending hours in discussion in the Situation Room and in discussion with our European counterparts. And that's an opportunity for China, because you cannot operate an active Indo-Pacific policy where your most senior members of the national security team are dealing with Russia challenge. And they sometimes travel to Asia, and remember that Asia still exists, but it will be very different. And then the other part, I think that the West right now is in this celebratory mode that, oh, we didn't expect from ourselves the level of unity that we were ready to stand up to tyrant and support Ukraine. And it's for a reason. And I think that if you play Team West, there is a reason to celebrate. The problem is that the downsides of inflation will fuel the very same division lines that are the genuine source of the current problems in Western societies. It's not that the rise of authoritarian China is the source of US relative decline. It's issues in like the divisions in the American society that are a source of Trumpism. And it's not even Vladimir Putin interference. So inflation, the food inflation will hit the developing world very hard. And like rising prices for grain were one of the sources of the Arab Spring. And then fuel and food will also kind of help to tear the fabrics of Western societies further apart. And if that's coupled with the need to spend more on the Pentagon rather than on more inclusive education and health system, long-term, that's bad for the West. And long-term, that benefits China as a competitor.
So could you say that this is part of Putin's expectation that things will turn so bad in Europe in a few months that he'll be able to basically resist that pressure from the West?
I don't think that he has anticipated the level of the sanctions. I think that my reading of the situation is that there was this genuine attempt of Biden administration to prevent this war. And the Biden administration was pursuing separate tracks simultaneously. There was this naming and shaming, so leaking of the intelligence that was known to the West and say, hey, we put you, Mr. Putin, in the hot seat. We show that we know what you're going to do. You're going to not deceive anybody. We're going to tell the world what we know, and that it's you trying to invade your sovereign neighbor for no reason. And then if you do that, don't think that it's going to be a very easy walk into Ukraine, because we're going to supply them with weapons. We're going to help them militarily, that it's a poisonous pill, and it's not going to be as easy as you think. And then we also put in place crushing economic sanctions on you, so you will pay the price. And then finally, if you want to avoid this, there is a diplomatic path, and we see that you have some legitimate and genuine security concerns in Europe. So let's talk about that. Like, you are unhappy about the type of weapons we sent to Ukraine. We're open to talk. You're unhappy about the missile defense system in Europe. Okay, let's talk about the possibility for your officers to inspect the sites in Poland and Romania. So many issues were in this response that was leaked to El País later on. That were, if I'm Russia, that's the best deal you can ever get from the US. But unfortunately, Mr. Putin had this very different plan and design in his mind. So Team Biden tried to avoid this, knowing that it's going to be bad for the US. But Vladimir Putin left the US no other choice. And I think that right now, because like these terrible things are happening, and there are new events in Bucha. I don't think that we've seen the ugliest pictures of this war. They're probably coming. Like pictures from Mariupol are disastrous. And then it's not that you can really sit on your hands and said, oh, we put all the sanctions possible, we are done. You cannot go to war with Russia because that will trigger World War III most likely. And then there is a certain amount of things you can do to help Ukraine defend itself. But then the consensus on the sanctions and the level of pain that you're ready to absorb in Western society shifts. And there are voters and opposition parties and people inside the ruling parties who demand more action. So it's a terrible situation for the global economy as well, but that's the price the West for now is willing to pay. And then I don't think that people really anticipate this long-term consequences. So it's short-term and long-term, and then people's compassion towards Ukrainians is just so mobilized that somebody who goes up and says like, oh, wait a minute, it's not only because Germany is cynical, but they also have a point, and then it's about the political health of our societies. Like these people are very likely to be ostracized as Putin-Versteher or whatever. So that's this dramatic situation right now.
Let me turn to a couple. I know we're starting to run out of time. We still have lots of unanswered questions here in the chat box. What do you think, asks Stuart Grosvenor, is the best scenario, the best desired outcome for China in this situation?
The hostilities stop at some point. There is a certain negotiated settlement that is a compromise on both sides. The sanctions,
partition of Ukraine potentially.
well, and then we go into whether a negotiated compromise is possible. And at this stage, to me, it's impossible. The parties are just miles away, and there are unreconcilable things that are just, for me, very difficult to envisage either Vladimir Putin or the West and President Zelensky and the Ukrainian society making a compromise. So it's just not in the cards for now. But then it's either a negotiated settlement at some point, or there is a de facto ceasefire. There is no peace agreement, but there is a de facto ceasefire. There is a de facto line of contact that leaves part of Ukraine occupied by Russia.
So that's de facto partition.
This is a de facto partition.
Yeah, sort of like the Korean War.
Right. But then there are no new sanctions applied. There is no new kind of Bucha massacres and stuff. So it's an occasional shelling. There are occasional provocations, but it's not an all-out war the way we are seeing it now.
And the Chinese would be happy with this, I think, at this point.
Yeah, that's not the ideal outcome, but that's probably the best outcome, because then the situation stabilizes in Russia.
Yeah.
And then you can see what kind of commercial opportunities you have there and what can you squeeze out of you're so much more junior partner than before the whole war started.
Okay, questions from the audience. Got maybe time for one or two more questions. Sorry, yeah.
Hi, my name is Tim. Sun Tzu talks about building a golden bridge of retreat for your enemies. Is there a possible solution that the US, China, Ukraine, Russia could work on building together as a way of de-escalating the situation in your mind?
I don't think so, unfortunately. I think that Vladimir Putin is really determined to achieve his goals in Ukraine. Whether that's achievable on the battleground is very much questionable, because a lot of Russian military assumptions going into this war are now challenged by the brave and capable Ukrainian resistance and by massive Western help, because sharing intelligence real time and many other stuff that's just much less visible than supply of military weapons is playing a crucial role in this war. So whether Russia will have resources to defeat Ukraine militarily is questionable, or it has to resort to much more brutal forces. Like Russia has barely touched its air force, and like bombardment, long range artillery, missiles, and just if you cannot conquer Kiev, you can flatten it to the ground. And unfortunately, Russia has experiences in doing so in Grozny and Aleppo or something. So Vladimir Putin seems to be determined, and as one of my Carnegie colleagues describes it, the West is in pain contest with Vladimir Putin, and you don't want to be in pain contest with Vladimir Putin, because the amount of pain that this guy is ready to absorb so far is really astonishing. And then it looks like there is nobody inside the system who can challenge him on this. And then there are no institutional checks and balances or societal pressure to say, wait a minute, that means that we're going to become North Korea by the end of this year. We don't want that. It's not what the Russian people tell him. For now, they are uninformed, and the bulk of them supports this war. So as long as this is the case, I don't think that there is a credible solution, because the West will not force Ukraine to do anything. President Zelensky is unlikely to go out and say, dear fellow Ukrainians, like, we are a heroic nation, but in order to stop bloodshed, we need to make some painful compromises and accept Russian control over these parts of Donbass. That's not going to happen. Even if that happens for some reason, which I don't buy, and I think that President Zelensky has this habit of kind of saying, oh, let the Ukrainian people decide, we put it on a referendum, with very clear idea that the Ukrainian people will say no. But even if he gives this order, not necessarily that the army and the society will follow that order. I think that the Ukrainians are determined to fight, and they don't want to surrender. So this is this tragic situation that, unfortunately, it's not that much that can be done at this point. Carnegie carries this Wars for International Peace in its name, but unfortunately, this is just a very ugly situation right now that, without Putin changing his mind, doesn't really have a very good solution. So everybody continues to do what they want to do. Ukrainians continue to fight. The West continues to provide military support and some sanctions, hopefully thinking about the second order, third order effects for the global economy and for the Western societies in general too. And then Russia hopefully at some point finds the price unacceptable and changes course or diminishes its outsized appetites and demands in Ukraine.
Okay, so we've got time for maybe one final question.
Hi, my name is Filippo Brunner, German-Italian student. Thank you very much for coming and for having this discussion. I'm not very knowledgeable about the two regions, so that's why I find it great. My question was about the internal challenges to Putin. I was wondering whether there is leeway, for example, maybe in the elite, because we've seen that also historically in Russia, the population has not been able to oust any leader. So if probably then it would come from the elite. Whether this is possible in your opinion, and what the Chinese stance would be. Would they support or would they not have a role at all? Would they prefer to support maybe Putin? Just your opinion on that. Thank you.
I don't think that China has any agency here, and they don't want to interfere and support, because their familiarity with the Russian elite is also somewhat superficial. And I don't think that we have really good examples for them doing something in a country of magnitude of Russia.
They did. So this is a funny story. In 1991, when the coup, attempted coup
Right.
happened, they came out on the side of the coup,
Right.
Which was a huge embarrassment because it collapsed after 3 days.
Right.
So I think,
I think that they will be super cautious. It's hard to navigate what's going on in the elite, but I give you a couple of points. First, we are in the 6th week of war. And like, the war is tragedy and terrible in pragmatic sense for Russia, because soldiers are dying, the economy is going bust. But then even the moral dimension, it's very hard to process for many Russians, because Ukraine is a neighbor, used to be a friendly nation for many years. And it's a very complicated relationship. But for bulk of Russians, an idea that you go to war and bombard Kiev and kill Ukrainian kids is just not very attainable. And particularly for the educated people who are kind of aware of what's going on. So despite this, we not have seen any single departure in the government on any level, not an attaché in Rome or anywhere would go out of the Russian embassy and say, this war is terrible, immoral, I'm against it, I'm seeking political asylum. There are a couple of people who have left without making anti-war statements. So they basically defected from state-owned companies and from some government positions. Like Anatoly Chubais is perhaps the most important. Dvorkovich stepped down because he was criticized. So he has these two hats, former deputy prime minister who's in charge of large innovation foundation, but he's also the chairman of FIDE, the Global Chess Association. So FIDE has criticized the war, and then he was criticized as saying, oh, it's a former official who has an official, semi-official position in the Russian government. So he stepped down from his semi-official position, keeping his chess hat on. So it's a different story. Not anybody has denounced this war or defected. And then as time goes by, it's harder to do so because the consensus solidifies. The oligarchs, some of them are critical, but it's a very mild criticism. And those who dare to criticize the war are mostly outside of Russia. So that's one metrics. The elite shows remarkable cohesion, and it's united by propaganda, by fear, because you cannot safely travel outside of Russia, and you are not sure whether you will be detained on the border or not. And then what really matters are the guys, big guys with big guns that stand around Putin, those who can really stage a coup. Because you can be worth 30 billion bucks in Russia, but you are not a political player, because one or two phone call from the Kremlin will crush your business empire and will put you behind bars. So oligarchs in Russia are not political figures. They are figures for this kind of dark place beneath the surface for resources, rent, but they are not political figures. So these guys behind the army, the law enforcement, they are all part of the decision-making process. And they're all doomed because they have been there on the sanctions list since 2014, most of them. They have no out. They know that they're chained to Putin and they will go down with him. And that's why they're going to support him. So as long as this guy is there, I don't think that we're going to see real cracks in the elite.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this fantastic.
On this happy note.
On this happy note.
I'm sorry for not sparking more optimism. In Bologna, it looks like a crime to speak about gloomy topics, but
well, look, we are very fortunate to have you, Alex, and it's been a fascinating discussion. So thank you for coming here to Bologna to talk to us, and thank you for all those online who have stayed with us. Come back.
Thank you so much. Thanks for spending your time.